And good news and bad news on the smoking front.
Judith Mackay. Okay, we'll get started now. If you could take your seats. Thank you, everybody. So thank you very much, everybody, for coming. Many people from a long way away for not the retirement party for Richard, but really to celebrate both his past achievements and his future achievements. Sarah and I put the program together, and it's been extremely difficult not letting Richard know anything about it or even who was coming. And so it's probably a bit of a surprise and shock for him to see what's going to happen. I really do want to thank everybody for making such an effort to come today. I'd also like to thank Bella Pratt and her team for organizing this meeting and for helping people to photographs of Richard in compromising and uncompromising positions. Asking everybody to come up with their 3 words that described Richard, but we thought that could be complicated. So I thought I would come up with my 3 anyway. Irritating, inspiring, illuminating. But then I thought, actually, it doesn't really summarize what I feel about Richard and what I've seen about Richard in terms of the way in which he's approached his career, his work. And the word that really came to mind was generosity. I first met Richard in 1981. I came here from St. Thomas's Hospital Medical School. I had a day off from my job in the surgical unit, which is the most boring job I've ever done. I had read Peter Armitage's book, and it's wonderful to see Peter Armitage here. And I rang him the day before, and I said, could I come and see him? And he generously said yes. I said, could I come tomorrow? And he sort of hesitated and said yes. And I met him, and I told him I'd like to get to know about research and doing clinical trials. And he said, you must meet Richard Peto. So he rang up Richard Peto, and Richard obviously said on the phone, I'm too busy. But he can come over and make an appointment to meet with me. So I walked on to the old Radcliffe Department of Medicine corridor, and I found Richard Peto too busy fixing a chair. I think that's where I saw the generosity. He brought me into his office. He sat me. The door burst open, and in came Rich Dole. And he saw Richard Peto, who was meant to be working on the causes of cancer, which was... that's where I saw irritation. Richard Dole was incandescent with rage. That instead of working on what he was meant to be working on, he wasn't fixing the chair anymore, but he was now talking to someone who had literally come off the street. I was then packed off, but then offered a job to come and work here for a year back in 1981 and have been here ever since. But I've seen him do that for so many people. I've seen him give so much time, so much help, so much guidance and support to people who've come off the streets in much the same way, or that he's met in a bar and then employed, like Richard Gray. And it is that generosity. But I'm sure that the 3 words I started with are probably words that some of you have come across. You know, you've spent weeks and months polishing your beautiful paper, and then in what appear to be a few flicks of a pen done overnight, probably through the night, it's been turned into something so much more than you wrote. so much more inspirational and illuminating in terms of your research findings that you hadn't seen. And I mean, I kind of think of him as an epidemiological alchemist. You lead and turning it into gold a lot of the time. And I mean, I thought when he and Richard Gray and Richard Dole did the 50-year follow-up of the British doctors, I thought, well, what else could you get from that? And he did, and got something really new out of it. And again, I've seen that. And again, the generosity is it's given to other people. So, yeah, irritate. Yeah, inspire. Yes, illuminate, but mainly generosity. He is also incredibly honest as a scientist. The only dishonesty that I can think of is that he kind of comes out with the Richard Dole mantra of, my job is to be an epidemiologist and generate the evidence, and it's for others to impact on policy. And that is the only untruth that I think I can really see, because one of the things that really I think matters to Richard is taking complexity and creating simplicity, creating a simple message without losing the scientific rigor. And one of the things that I think he finds beautiful is when those simple messages then get incorporated into the kind of ordinary world and become kind of mantras that everybody knows, the 100,000 deaths from smoking a year and things like that. And so I wanted to kick off with a video that really illustrates how these simple messages that Richard spends so much time getting right really impact on policy. So we'll just play a video, and then I'll hand over to Alan Lopez for the first session. Thank you.
Oh, good morning. That's hard to compete with, but it's entirely fitting that we have that introduction to the first session about the importance of tobacco. My name is Alan Lopez. I'm from the University of Melbourne in Australia. In 1987, three momentous events happened in southeast England, in increasing order of importance. There was a stock market crash. There was the worst storm of the century hitting southeast England. You may remember that, causing enormous damage, flattening trees, causing loss of life, etc., as storms do. And thirdly, I met Richard Peto. We met at a World Bank meeting convened by Richard Feacham at Leeds Castle. It was a very formal dinner, careful seating placement, and all the other trimmings of a dinner in a castle. You might remember Richard. At that time, I was working with the World Health Organization on global mortality analyses, producing the first ever global estimates of causes of death. This was in the pre-Chris Murray era, and had received data on over 1 million deaths in China. Richard came over to me, ejected the hapless person sitting beside me, opened up his £1 suitcase that he'd bought in the back streets of Beijing somewhere, and proceeded to mesmerize me with over 200 pages of computer output on causes of death in China from his various studies there. That was the start of a 30-year collaboration with Richard. I never got to eat much that night, and I never got invited back to dinners in castles anywhere in the UK. And in fact, I never got much sleep whenever I used to come to Oxford to work with Richard, including one notorious night, Richard, when we had an encounter with the Oxford Shark at 4 o'clock in the morning, dodged the local constabulary, met Richard Dole at 7 o'clock at the train station for a major press conference on tobacco mortality in London. But it was all worth it, as I'm sure many of you feel. As for many of you, these countless, extraordinary, punishing hours, Richard, spent working with you, carefully and persistently trying to get the epidemiology of big causes of avoidable death right, have vastly improved our understanding about who is dying of what, where, and how that is changing. So perhaps the most bleeding obvious thing to study is tobacco among the leading causes of death. And this is a graph from Emily Banks, also a colleague of Richard's, just showing in Australia. You've seen these graphs before in the UK and the United States, and we'll hear more from Mike Toon in a moment, but just showing the extraordinary impact of tobacco on life expectancy and mortality, with smokers on average losing about 10 years of life. Some work I'd done while I was still at WHO, which Richard and Mike and Toon and I and Jill Borum worked on, was this effort here to show just how tobacco affects public health globally. So this is a 100-year view, looking firstly at male smokers. So if you go back to 1900, you get this massive uptake in smoking, so about 2 in 3 men are smoking. Gradually, you get the impact of public health reforms. And then 2 or 3 decades later, you get this extraordinary, wonderful, extraordinary, absurd curve in mortality, so that ultimately tobacco at its peak is killing about 1 in 4 males. It never killed as many females, but females started smoking some decades later than males and started to die in large numbers also some decades later, killing around about 1 in 5 females at its peak. So tobacco epidemic is something we've studied very well. We know very, very well the full impact on population health, and we know very well this amazing delay that we should not underestimate. Some work I've done with Chris Murray on the global burden of disease, and I'm sure there's many critics of this in the audience, but what I think matters is not so much the numbers, but to note that for males in 2016 worldwide, of all the preventable causes of death, tobacco was the second, about 10 or 11%. In other words, the world would have been 10% healthier in 2016 had no one ever smoked. And I think that's a very, very good basis for why we need to study tobacco. Richard and I and Jill Borum, Mike Toon, started to collaborate in the late 1980s when I was at WHO, and we produced this volume, which is now, I think, in its 3rd edition. It was an interesting experience, I'm sure, what many of you have had with Richard. We worked together on a method that Richard wrote down on a napkin in a bar in Madrid somewhere. I've still got the napkin. And the numbers came out at about 2 million approximately deaths from tobacco. 4 years later, 4 punishing years working with Richard, we finally published our Lancet paper, which was the basis for this book. It wasn't that it took so long to publish, but it was typical of Richard wanting to get the numbers right and plausible. And it is those numbers that have had a great impact on tobacco control policy worldwide. It is those numbers that have had a great impact on the World Health Organization taking tobacco control seriously. And this is the reason why. These show the fraction of deaths in middle age, males in blue, females in red, in Australia, the Netherlands, the UK, and USA, taken from that book and subsequent editions, showing that at the height of the epidemic in the United Kingdom, almost 1 in 2 men who died in middle age, this is not old age, 1 in 2 men who died in middle age in this country in the 1970s and 1980s died as a result of tobacco. And you can see the female rise coming some decades later and then evening out. United States, the epidemic less severe than the United Kingdom and also a little later. So borrowing some numbers from Richard, you can see the slides. He always put his slides in very big print so that I could read them. But it just shows the extent of tobacco today. I've shown you the dallies that come from tobacco, but just looking in terms of the body count, the numbers of deaths, killing about 2 million people a year in rich countries, about 1 million in China, 1 million in India. Maybe they're a little bit more, but not much. Some hundreds of thousands elsewhere. Globally, about 6 million deaths a year. 6 million out of 55 million people who die every year die as a result of tobacco, and that number is rising, so that in our lifetime, by the beginning of next decade or early next decade, we will begin to see those numbers creep up, we think, to around 10 million deaths a year. What does this mean in terms of big, large numbers? In the 4 decades of this, until the middle of this century, approximately 400 million people, if those numbers are right. If 10 million people are dying every year, do the maths, in the next 4 decades, it'll be about 400 million. It will keep on rising. It will keep on rising as long as prevalence and tobacco consumption keeps rising, particularly in men in developing countries, so that we'll have probably in excess of 500 million deaths in the second part of this century. All up, we will have about 1 billion people killed by tobacco, 1 billion people killed by tobacco this century, compared to about 100 million last century, much more than any wars and most other leading causes of death. This is a serious global public health problem that Richard has focused his science on. But what are the things that we need to monitor the tobacco epidemic? Firstly, prevalence of exposure, the good work that's being done in many countries to monitor the people who are smoking, how that is changing, at what ages, how much they're smoking. What are they dying from? We are vastly ignorant about causes of death in the world in many populations. Inexcusable. Indonesia, 4th largest population in the world. No one has a clue what the pattern of community deaths in Indonesia are. There is no data. But more importantly, it's what Richard and colleagues have been leading for the last 2 or 3 decades, the evolving hazards of tobacco with increasing duration of exposure, particularly in large, poor countries. So with apologies to Richard, this is a slide I've stolen directly from him. What is it that we could do to increase global health, or at least protect global health? Avoid catastrophic war, famine, epidemic infections, including, for example, antimicrobial resistance. The world could get a lot worse than what it currently is. It's highly improbable, but it could be catastrophic. But what is much more probable is making today's effective treatments that we know about progressively more widely available worldwide and accessible. ART, secondary treatment for major vascular diseases, screening and drug therapy for cancer come to mind. Richard has worked in all of those. But most of all, working harder on prevention. We know prevention works, and it works particularly for tobacco control. We've seen evidence of that in country after country, but not enough. And finally, Richard's mantra that he reminds us all, better a moderate reduction in a big cause than a big reduction in a small cause. Don't confuse the few big causes with the many small causes, something he has taught us all. And finally, you'll recognize the handsome man on the left there in the suit from WHO, and the person beside him. This is our 1998, 20 years ago this year. We published those papers in the British Medical Journal, Richard, on tobacco in China. The world, Richard, really wants you to, it's been a remarkable journey these last 20 years, and what we need to do is make sure that it does not end. So what we found in China 20 years ago, we're finding is getting worse. We need to find that more often and monitor this epidemic. So the work on tobacco that Richard has led has been inspirational, as Rory said, not only to us, his colleagues and friends here today, but to many, many other colleagues around the world. And it's an enormous pleasure to be able to chair a session where we're going to hear contributions from various people to addressing this absurd global public health problem that is not going away. There's a series of speakers today. You can see them in your program. I'm not going to introduce them. They can introduce themselves, keeping in mind speakers Richard's mantra to organizational experts around the world where I've been on the same podium with Richard, saying, don't talk about me very much because you're taking away time from my speech. And so I would give that advice to all of you. Introduce yourself as much as you like, but you'll only get the time that you have in the program. So I'd like to firstly turn over now to a collaborator who's worked a lot with Richard and I, to some extent, on tobacco and alcohol, Mike Toon. He unfortunately could not join us today, but he's going to speak to us from a video. And then...
Good morning. I'm Tom Frieden, and about 15, 20 years ago, I was at a dinner at the Johns Hopkins School of Public Health, and I was sitting next to somebody. I didn't catch his name. And over the course of the dinner, an article that had just come out came up, and I was vigorously critical of the article and its methods, and my dinner companion was defending them. And we spent the whole dinner arguing about this very vigorously. And at the end of the dinner, he said, well, I'm Richard Pito, and I was the senior author on that article. And I felt absolutely awful. I'm rarely in doubt and often wrong. Richard, I find, always has a healthy skepticism about data and willing to reconsider. And he said, no, it's great. Most people don't argue with me when they know who I am. So that was my introduction to Richard Pito. I've had the honor and privilege of chatting with him and working with him over the years, and most importantly, learning from him and trying to use some of the things that he has discovered in advocacy and in the practice of epidemiology. So comes back to a very straightforward fact, that the death rate is a fact. Anything beyond this is an inference from William Farr. Also, that the classic quotation that all of us think of, that death in old age is inevitable, but death before old age is not. And these two core facts lead to what I, as a public health practitioner, think as the key role for prioritization. Prioritization is always hard. It's like appointing someone. When you appoint one person, you get one ingrate and many enemies. When you prioritize a problem, you have the accountability of have you made progress against that problem, and resentment from all the other programs, why haven't you emphasized them. But you have to follow Sutton's law, and for those of you who don't know, Willie Sutton was a bank robber. When asked, apocryphally actually, why he robbed banks, he said simply, that's where the money is. Now, when it comes to premature death, cardiovascular disease and cancer are where the money is. These are the two things that cause more than 85%, or about more than 80%, depending on how you count it, of all of the premature deaths in the 30 to 69-year-old age group. So if you want to make a big difference on reducing premature death, you'd better focus on cardiovascular disease and cancer. And what are the main drivers of cardiovascular disease and cancer? You'll have some disagreement on some of these things here, but you'll have no disagreement that the leading cause is smoking. Also unhealthy diet, particularly excess sodium consumption, and including the consumption of artificial trans fat, physical inactivity, excess alcohol consumption, which, as we all know, is defined as drinking more than your doctor. Some debate on this next point, but small particulate air pollution. And I would add to this medical care failures, the failure to prevent heart attacks, strokes, and cancers that could have been prevented, especially from uncontrolled hypertension. Working with the World Health Organization, a series of technical packages has been released. Each of these has a specific approach, one to reduce smoking, another to reduce sodium consumption, another to reduce uncontrolled hypertension. These packages can make a major difference in practice. This is our experience from New York City. In New York City, we increased the tax, not quite as much as in the video that you just saw, but we increased it now. It's more than $12 per pack of cigarettes. We implemented the Smoke-Free Air Act, and we launched hard-hitting ads which reduced adult smoking by 40% and teen smoking by 2/3. And there's a typo there, between 2001 and 2016. Globally, this number comes from Richard and colleagues' work and is one that every time I say it, I think I must have a digit wrong. It can't be 1 billion people. And you go back and do the maths, and it is. And it is just a shocking number. And I always add, unless urgent action is taken. The WHO Empower strategy works, especially tax, but tax is the least implemented of all of the components of it. There has been progress, as you saw in previous presentation, in the OECD, and in the past few years, there has been largely unheralded progress in low and middle-income countries, with more than 30 million fewer smokers between rigorously conducted global adult tobacco surveillance studies, GATT studies, initial and follow-up in India, Russia, Brazil, Philippines, and Ukraine. more than 30 million fewer smokers in those 5 countries alone as a result of effective implementation of only parts of the Empower strategy. Imagine what we could do if you had full implementation of the strategy all over the world. As a result, for the first time in human history, cigarette sales are falling. The FCTC came into force in 2005 and 2007. We launched the Bloomberg Initiative and the WHO Empower strategy. That's gradually been implemented around the world, and you see for the first time a decline. Fast enough? No. Soon enough? No. Deep enough? No. But a decline, a turning point. Now, it's not only tobacco. A wonderful quotation by Jeffrey Rose: of all the threats to human health, alcohol causes the widest range of injury. It shortens life, being responsible for between 1% and 10% of all adult deaths in industrialized countries. It shrinks the brain and impairs the intellect. It causes failure of the liver, heart, and peripheral nerves. It contributes to depression, violence, and the breakup of personal and social life. It has been blamed for 1/4 of all deaths on the road. And Richard's work on this in Russia has shown that in a country like Russia, which smokes to a huge extent but drinks even more, alcohol uniquely can be a greater cause of death than tobacco. 3 million deaths a year estimated, the 7th leading cause of death, 10% of deaths among working-age people in the US, enormous economic costs, but there are scalable interventions. And I emphasize the term scalable. It's fine to have something that works for a few people, but unless you can scale to the population, you won't have a major impact. Tax, minimum price, regulating the hours and places of sale, banning or restricting advertising, and enacting and enforcing strong drink driving laws. All of these things can make a major difference in reducing the impact of alcohol. Not easy and not quick. One of my mentors, Sir John Crofton, pushed me hard to do alcohol control in addition to tobacco control when I was health commissioner in New York City. I said, but it'll take a long time. And he said, that's why we have to start now. Fine particulate matter air pollution. Basically, you have unhealthy ways of cooking and heating with dust, wood, charcoal, and coal, which are non-solid fuels, kerosene, then gas and LPG. And you can knock out about 20% of sodium without most people noticing. In addition, if you gradually reduce it over time, people will not know the difference. The estimate here is about 1.6 million lives saved per year if we can get a 30% reduction in sodium. Artificial trans fat. I have to recognize Dr. Coke McCord, who's here in the audience. Dr. McCord was working for us in New York City, read a textbook of nutrition, came in and said, you know, I think we could probably do something about artificial trans fat. I said, what in the world is artificial trans fat? This is partially hydrogenated vegetable oil. You bubble hydrogen through oil. It becomes solid at room temperature, which is great for pie crusts. Unfortunately, it is not great for your coronary arteries. And what we learned is that we could essentially define it as a toxic substance. It's been described as the tobacco of nutrition. We eliminated it in New York City and were able to show a substantial impact. Trans fat kills an estimated 500,000 people a year globally. It raises the LDL and it lowers the HDL, so you could eat suet instead and still be healthier. The sources of trans fat globally are varied. Of course, it's much better to switch to polyunsaturated oils. Healthier alternatives will not change the cost of food, the taste of food, or prevent foods from being manufactured. Only your heart will know the difference. Just last month, the World Health Organization released a technical package to eliminate artificial trans fat from the world by 2023. This is exciting. This is big. This is big news. This is the first elimination program in the non-communicable disease space. It is a technical action pack. First, review the status of different oils. Second, promote polyunsaturated. Legislate or regulate to eliminate artificial trans fat. Assess levels in food and, if possible, in people. Create awareness among policymakers and others. And enforce the law. And if we do this, within years. High blood pressure kills more people than any other condition. In fact, more than all infectious diseases combined. About last year, a millimeter increase in systolic blood pressure doubles vascular mortality in the ages of 35 to 69. Lower is better. The recent SPRINT trial from the US shows that down to 120 over 80. ourselves. Doctors mess it up every time. When we go to medical school, they take the neurons out of protocol-based care is superior. Care is patient-centered, so that blood pressures are widely known. The barriers are that to get that many controlled. You're talking about tens of millions of people in India and China, and many millions in other countries, very populous. The program I lead now called Resilience, which are not currently being done, and that's what we need to do. So in the next brief bit of this, for 30 to 69-year-olds, could we achieve a 1/3 reduction by 2030? Well, if you look cardiovascular disease, cancer, concurrent rate, you're not using a life table to say what you can do with hypertension management. How are we doing improving diet by eliminating artificial trans fat and reducing sodium, by restricting advertising and promotion of tobacco, alcohol, and unhealthy food, and by behavior change, by creating conditions. And below that, how are we doing on the cross-cutting areas that we need to track, monitoring frameworks,